Welcome to unit number 2. Today we're going to be discussing the big philosophical questions, and we are going to do this in terms of the PowerPoint notes and this video. As usual, the PowerPoint notes will be down the bottom, although the video will contain more than the PowerPoint notes. Also, at the end of this video, you'll have the opportunity to do a class exercise which will help you reflect upon your own views, values and philosophy, but more about that when we come to it. So let's move on now and see where we're going. We're going to talk about these first order questions. I mentioned in the last video that we'd come back to that today and have a little more discussion about it and have that move into the concept of worldviews. And even though that may not be as popular academically in some respects in today's learning circles, I think it's very valuable in helping us understand our own values and our own views and being able to justify them and be comfortable studying other views and be open to discussions. Anyway, and you begin to identify your own presuppositions in that process and hopefully be comfortable with then critically reflecting upon other ideas as well. So with that in mind, let's turn to first order questions. We've mentioned already that first order questions are these big questions of philosophy. They are really the core subject matter of philosophy. What is a good life? What is justice? What is real? What is true? What are the criteria for something to be real and something to be true and something to be valuable? What's beautiful? Second order questions are basically the philosophical questions of other subjects. When you establish the answer to your basic question, what is a good life, then all your further discussions about that and questions about it become second order questions. And so second order questions are examples of what's the philosophy of history. Or in terms of justice, for example, your political science becomes a second order issue. Sometimes to discuss first order questions, you need to include some second order questions as well. And you'll see that when we come to talk about Plato's Republic a little later on in the course. So with that distinction, first order questions, second order questions, first order questions, the subject matter of philosophy. Let's then move on from this to a little summary of these first order questions that might help us. These are illustrations. What is a good life? The pre-Socratic philosophers are going to discuss this in various ways. Perhaps the most famous discussion of what is a good life is that set forth by Socrates, as Plato records the discussion around his trial and ultimate execution. Socrates went around Athens asking questions and debating with people. He never wrote anything down. We only know about him through Socrates and some of the Greek poets and writers. But Socrates defined the good life as a life that required you to ask questions and to be open to thinking about things afresh. He went around saying that he knew nothing, and he went asking questions in order that he might learn. Put another way, for Socrates, not only was the unexamined life not worth living, his mantra, but for Socrates, it was a love of learning. That was what a good life was, learning and growing. Well, what other sorts of big questions or first order questions might we just remind ourselves of at this point? Well, what's the purpose of life? Why are we here? Does human life have intrinsic value? And when does it have intrinsic value? Is there a time when it does and a time when it doesn't? And if so, why doesn't it? When we look at the universe, we see a unity and a disunity. We see a single thing and we see many parts. What's the relationship between the one and the many? And that's a very big question. And then what's the very nature of the universe? Is it really an ordered system? Is it really intelligible? Is it something that makes sense? And then, of course, in that context, the big question is, what's the relationship between the things that don't change in the world and the things that do change? Because there are things that simply do change. For example, you. You are always you. But on the other hand, you're not exactly the same as you were a month ago, a year ago. And you won't be the same you in a month or 2 months' time. And yet there's a sense in which you are clear to you. And so what's the relationship between change and non-question change? Now, these are questions that pre-Socratics began addressing, and when we come in our next discussion to talk about the pre-Socratics and their answers to these questions, we'll see they're beginning the process of philosophical thought and discussion. All right, now we know to turn aside from this little discussion about first-order questions and big questions, how they're read to second-order questions. And we need to begin to think about a very important issue. Throughout this course, you're going to be confronted with new ideas, different ideas. And you're going to have your present ideas challenged, and sometimes it's going to be difficult for you to even begin to think about the ideas and the discussions being put forward by some of the philosophers. And that's going to be true not only the ancient philosophers, but some of the modern philosophers. And you're going to go, what is this all about? And for you to be able to think and listen and comprehend those, you're realizing that what you think and the way you think is in fact being challenged. And that can be uncomfortable. Having to seriously think and reflect upon different views and on different answers to big questions can be tiresome, exhausting, tired, but also those different views can challenge our own personal philosophies and ideologies, and that can be a real way of concern for us. What's important at this point is, number one, to realize that the study of philosophy doesn't require you to change your views, but rather it calls upon you to reflect upon your views and develop a justification for your views. And what's more, if we're able to do that, we become more and more comfortable with having a dialogue with the ancient philosophers, modern philosophers, and with one another. However, we must get past the obstacles to this serious reflection and dialogue. And so that brings us to worldviews. And this requires a little bit of discussion as we approach it. Now, academic discussions about worldviews, which really come to us through German Romanticism. It comes from the German word, Weltanschauung. The idea of looking at the world as a total system, seeing everything interconnected, and interpreting events that are taking place in the light of that view we have of the world. Now, that view, by the 1960s, began to be associated with ideologies. Worldviews and ideologies are kind of interchangeable one for the other. It's not strictly correct, but it's what began to happen. And the reason that they became is there was a growing dissatisfaction with the role ideologies had played. Because by the time in the 1960s we had 2 world wars, we had the development of the great super Russian power and the conflict between East and West, the Cold War. And in the West there was a growing dissatisfaction with the use of ideologies. And in 1960, Daniel Bell published a series of essays called The End of Ideology. And one of the things he said in that series of essays was, once upon a time, ideologies told us what mattered. That was his concern. He believed we had some way to get past ideologies because it was ideologies that wouldn't leave free people to be able to see one another and talk with one another and communicate. He goes on in his work to say, a total ideology is an all-inclusive system of comprehensive reality. It is a set of beliefs infused with passion and seeks to transform the whole of a way of life. Now, that's a pretty good definition, not only of an ideology, but also a worldview. But he goes on then to say, which reflects his concern, and the concern of many, that commitment to ideology, the yearning for a cause, or the satisfaction of deep moral feelings, is not necessarily a reflection of the interests of the shape of those ideas. Ideology in this sense, he goes on to say, as he uses them, is nothing less than a secular religion. Now, Daniel Bell described himself as a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. And he represented a movement in academic thinking of those who are concerned to look and ask the question, what is it about Western democracy, the liberal democracies, which enables them to function? And the stumbling block to those democracies functioning was seen to be the various ideologies and worldviews. Indeed, thus it's antithetical. And the suggestion really was from those who were followers of Bell and the liberal, democratically minded perspective is that they're replaced by pragmatism and pluralism. The affirmation of different views being valuable, having those views worked in to create a pragmatic or practical solution to life's problems and issues, and hence the putting aside of worldviews. Well, notwithstanding those academic concerns about worldviews and ideologies, there are benefits to us using a process of reviewing our worldviews in this course. It will benefit us in the study. It can help us understand ourselves, understand our own views, and understand the strengths and limitations of the way we've justified our views, and help us be at peace about reflecting and seriously thinking about other new ideas and new perspectives. And so it's valuable, I think, for us to have a study of our worldview, your worldview. And to that end, let's go back to the Greeks. And here we'll connect it with the course. Those early Greek philosophers, beginning with the pre-Socratics and moving on into Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, they all began to have a shift in worldview. They began examining the world from that perspective, from the perspective of reason rather than the perspective of mythology. Now, Plato was probably the first of these philosophers to have a fully developed worldview, a total package of the cosmos. And when we come to him, we'll have a look at his worldview. And let's pause again just to remind ourselves of a much more, I think, neutral definition. A worldview is an intellectual or mental tool for bringing together in a single set of ideas, an idea picture, if you will, of life, culture, and its relationship to reality. It can be summed up a mental picture of the world around us. And here's the point. Every one of us has a worldview, whether we've articulated or not. We all have our prejudice, we all have our presuppositions, we all have a view of the world, and it's good for us to be self-conscious about it. And these are the sort of questions the worldview is looking at. What's the origin of the world? Where did it come from? What's mankind? Where did it come from? What's ultimate reality? Very important question, what's the nature of the universe? Is it ordered, chaotic? Is it a pattern? What exactly is it? How does it work? At an essential level. What's the nature of mankind? Is mankind good, bad? Are they neutral? What are they? Are they political animals? Are they animals? What are they? And how do we distinguish human beings from the rest of the cosmos? What makes us different? Are we better? For example, most Western thinking on this topic has had mankind as being the crown of creation. But today, particularly with some of the more extreme ecology movements, the insistence that the man is just simply another part of the whole cosmos system, and he's not more important, not more significant than the other part. Worldview. And why are we here? What's the purpose of life? What's the nature of human society? What's the purpose of human society? This is a bigger question, whether you should have democracy or monarchy. It's a question of, why do you have a human society? Is there life after death? Is there a soul? Is there a mind? What's justice? These are sort of worldview questions. You see, they're all tied up with the big questions. You can't talk about big questions without talking about worldview questions. They're interconnected. And being self-conscious about what we think about some of the major ones is important. And so I've let underlying principles come out. You'll discover that often when you've thought through some of these worldview questions, there's a common theme or a common perspective, a common set of principles running through. It might be the theory of evolution, it might be subjectivism or pluralism, it might be the nature of the laws of nature, it may be physics, science, any one of those things. It might be theism. I'll let you, this is just a list of those. What's important for us is becoming aware of our own worldview. And in a moment I'll come back to a class exercise I've got for you, which will help you think about your worldview and developing it. It's not going to be examined, you don't have to send it to me. You're free to use it to your own benefit, and hopefully it will help you reflect upon where you stand and be comfortable as you begin to process of getting involved with other world, other views. But before we move on, what are the key items you need to know? Well, again, in this one, what are first order questions and how you distinguish them from second order questions? What's a worldview? Know what its function is, especially now we're using in this course. What are the worldview questions? And most importantly, what is your worldview? The quickly class assignment. Here it is for you today. Attached, well, actually, separately in Weekly Unit 2, you'll find a Microsoft Word file which will set out some information for you, questions. It's a worksheet. You can print it off. You don't need to send it to me. Work your way through it and see if you can identify your worldview and see what presuppositions are running through it. If you have any real problems or issues, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to try and respond. I can't answer all the questions for you. Only you can answer those questions. But hopefully it'll help you. And just keep that aside. And you might even think about how that view that you write down and think about today might change as we go through this course. It may give you more sober reflections on some of those issues. Because each of the philosophers we're looking at will look at those questions in one way or another. So, looking forward to being with you the rest of the course, of course. And that brings us to the end of this video for Weekly Unit number 2. Thank you.